All right, let's jump right in today. We're diving deep into the world of polar bears.
Huh.
You know, beyond the headlines, you've sent over some really interesting research, and we're going to try to uncover some of those really amazing insights, about their history, their connection to these things called Polynyas, and what it all tells us about, how adaptable they are.
Yeah, polar bears are fascinating.
So when we talk about polar bears, I mean, most people think about them being way up in the Arctic.
Right.
But the research you sent, it kind of paints a different picture, right?
It does. I mean, when
Yeah.
we think about polar bears, yeah, we think about the high Arctic. But what's really interesting is that it reveals a much more dynamic picture of polar bears than maybe most people imagine.
So let's break it down. What are Polynyas?
So imagine like an oasis in a frozen ocean.
Oh, okay.
That's essentially what a polynya is. It's this recurring patch of open water or thin ice surrounded by much thicker ice.
Okay.
And these things aren't random. They form in very predictable locations due to currents and winds and things like that.
So it's like a polar bear cafe.
Yeah.
It's always open,
Yeah.
serving up those seal snacks.
Pretty much. And when we look at where polar bear fossils and archaeological remains are found, you find that they're very often clustered around modern-day Polynya locations.
Hmm.
So this suggests that there's a very long and strong connection between polar bears and Polynyas, this ecological relationship.
It's really interesting to picture, like, ancient polar bears in their favorite Polynya hotspots,
Right.
like thousands of years ago.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But there's also some talk about polar bear remains in some unexpected places,
Yeah.
like Iceland
Yeah.
and the Bering Sea.
Yeah, that's right. And these are what scientists call extraliminal finds. And what's interesting is that these finds often coincide with periods of significant sea ice expansion. So it suggests that polar bears actually naturally expand their range when conditions allow.
So they're not just stuck over there, they're kind of like opportunistic explorers.
Yeah, exactly. They take advantage of the opportunity. They go where the ice is, where the food is.
This reminds me of something you said about Zokov Island
Yeah.
in the Laptev Sea.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about thousands of polar bear bones discovered there. It's kind of hard to believe.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable. Over 5,900 bones representing at least 130 individuals.
Wow.
So it really does represent a significant concentration of polar bear activity.
What's really interesting to me is that this site dates back to the Holocene climatic optimum,
Mm-hmm.
which was warmer than today.
Right.
So it's kind of like it challenges the polar bears are doomed because of warming narrative.
It does. It adds some nuance to the discussion for sure. What Zokov Island tells us is that they were able to thrive even during a time when there was less sea ice. And it likely had to do with these Polynyas in the area. So it raises some interesting questions about, how vulnerable they actually are to climate change and, what role Polynyas play in their survival.
So these Polynyas are really important.
Yeah.
They're more than just a convenient hunting ground,
Right.
especially during those times when the environment is changing.
Yeah, exactly. They kind of provide this buffer
Oh,
against
yeah.
those fluctuations in sea ice. And they offer consistent access to seals, even when other areas are frozen solid. And this is a recurring theme that we see throughout polar bear history, is this resilience, this ability to adapt.
Speaking of history, this research you sent talks about how long humans and polar bears have been interacting.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking thousands of years.
It is, yeah. It's going back thousands of years. And one thing that's really interesting is that when you look at archaeological sites that have polar bear remains, a lot of them are near Polynyas. So it seems like humans and bears were both drawn to these resource-rich areas.
So they're not just hunting grounds for polar bears, they're gathering places for both species.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, raises a lot of questions about how they coexisted.
Right, right.
This is where indigenous knowledge becomes so important.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, indigenous communities have been living alongside polar bears for, millennia, observing their behavior, understanding their movements, really developing ways to coexist. And their knowledge just adds this depth and perspective that we can't get just from looking at bones, from archaeological remains alone.
Right. There's this narrative out there about polar bears facing extinction
Yeah.
because of climate change.
Right.
But some of these sources, especially the 2023 State of the Polar Bear Report, they paint a much more complex picture, don't they?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it actually suggests that the global polar bear population has likely increased in recent years, even with the fluctuations in sea ice. So it's a reminder that the situation is more nuanced than we often hear, in the news.
It definitely challenges the simple narrative. Like, if we only focus on sea ice decline, you might be overlooking a lot of other things.
Yeah, absolutely, And there are all these surprising factors that are at play. For instance, did you know that there's actually a distinct polar bear population in southeast Greenland? That relies on glacial ice to hunt.
Wait, glacial ice? So they're not just on the sea ice hunting?
No, they're not.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and while this behavior seems to be more common in this particular area, it does highlight that they are more resourceful
Mm.
and adaptable than we give them credit for, often. I mean, they can thrive in very diverse ice conditions, which could actually be really advantageous as
Yeah.
the Arctic changes.
Wow. This is already a lot more than I expected.
Yeah,
I mean, we've gone from ancient polar bears in Polynyas
right.
to this incredible discovery in Greenland.
Yeah,
It's like they're rewriting the polar bear rulebook.
right in front of us, exactly.
And it seems like we're just getting started.
Yeah.
Okay, so those glacial ice hunting polar bears,
Yeah.
it's mind-blowing.
It really is amazing, yeah.
It's like, are there any rules for polar bears anymore?
Right. They really do challenge our assumptions, and they're a really good reminder that, nature is full of surprises.
So let's talk about their diet.
Okay.
I mean, everyone knows polar bears love seals.
Right, yeah.
But with everything changing in the Arctic, how are they finding enough to eat?
That's the question, right? So seals are definitely, their number one choice. But what we're seeing is that they're actually pretty flexible. They're really opportunistic eaters.
So it's like a polar bear buffet.
Kind of, yeah.
What are they adding to their plates these days?
Well, one of the interesting things is they're incorporating more sea ice-derived carbon into their diet.
Sea ice-derived carbon.
Yeah, it sounds a little technical.
Yeah. What does that even mean, like in terms
Yeah.
of actual food?
So basically, think about all the life that's in and around the sea ice itself. Algae, crustaceans, and even, carcasses of marine mammals that have died and got frozen into the ice.
Hmm.
So they're finding ways to access these food sources, even when seals might be harder to find.
So they're not just waiting around for a seal to pop up.
Right,
They're foraging, like in the sea ice itself.
exactly.
That's pretty impressive.
It is, yeah.
But is it enough? I mean, does it give them the same energy and nutrients as a seal would?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it is something that researchers are still trying to figure out, really. But there is some data that's emerging about polar bear body condition.
Okay.
That's pretty encouraging. In areas where they've been observed, eating more of these non-seal foods,
Okay.
their body condition has remained pretty good.
Okay.
Like, for example, in the Barents Sea.
So even with these changes to their diet, they're still healthy.
Yeah.
And they're still maintaining that, body fat.
Yeah, which is a really good sign.
Yeah. It really shows how adaptable they are.
It does.
It makes you think, like, how long has this been part of their story?
Right.
I mean, we talked about the Holocene climatic optimum, but what about even earlier?
Well, so there's some groundbreaking research that's coming out about polar bears from the early Holocene. We're talking, roughly 11,300 to 9,700 years ago. Imagine this massive area of open water in the Arctic Ocean persisting for about 1,600 years.
Wow.
This is what scientists call the North Water Polynya. And the latest research is showing that polar bears didn't just survive this period, they actually thrived.
That's crazy.
Right.
Like a massive open water period for over 1,000 years.
Mhm.
And they just adapted.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about all the stuff they're facing today.
Right. It does put it into perspective. Knowing that they've made it through such huge changes in the past, it gives us a new appreciation for how resilient they are and how flexible they are from an evolutionary standpoint. But, while it's encouraging to look at this long view of things, it's also important to remember they're facing new challenges today.
You're talking about the human impact.
Yeah.
It's not just climate change anymore, it's hunting, interactions with human settlement.
Exactly, yeah. It's more about how we share the environment with them, or maybe don't share it so well. These human polar bear conflicts, they are a growing concern. And while climate change definitely plays a role, it's not the whole picture.
We touched on this earlier, but can you just remind us?
Yeah.
How do things like hunting restrictions, how could they actually be making these conflicts worse?
Yeah, it seems a little counterintuitive, but it really shows how even our best intentions to protect them can have some unexpected results. So large adult males, they're the dominant bears, and they often steal kills from younger or weaker bears.
Right.
In the past, hunting often targeted these large males, but with the restrictions now in place, these guys are more abundant, so there's more competition for food.
So basically, younger bears are kind of getting squeezed out.
Right.
They have to go further to find food,
Right.
which means they're coming closer to us.
Exactly, yeah. And it just shows how complex these interactions are and how important it is to consider all the different factors when we're thinking about how to protect them.
It does feel very interconnected.
It is.
Climate change, human activity, and polar bear behavior.
Yeah.
So are there any solutions?
Yeah. I mean, that's what a lot of researchers are focused on now, and there are some promising approaches like community-based monitoring programs
Okay.
where local communities are involved in tracking the bears, and also things like figuring out how to reduce attractants, like garbage dumps that might be drawing bears into towns,
Right.
and even using technology like GPS collars to keep track of where they're going.
It seems like traditional knowledge is also really important.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, indigenous communities have been living alongside polar bears for a very long time.
Yeah.
And they have this incredible amount of knowledge,
Yeah.
that can really help us figure out the best solutions. I mean, for example, in some areas, they're actually reviving traditional hunting practices, where they're specifically targeting large males to try to restore that more natural balance within the population.
Wow. It's amazing how much we can learn from those who've been living with these animals for centuries.
Yeah. I mean, combining their knowledge with modern science is really the way to go.
Okay, I got to be honest. My brain is a little overloaded with all this information.
It's a lot to take in. Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
it's a lot to take in. Can we try to break this down into some key takeaways?
Sure.
What are the most important things for people to understand about what polar bears are facing?
Okay, so let's zoom out and look at the big picture.
Okay.
First of all, polar bears are incredibly adaptable.
Yep.
We've seen that. Throughout their history, they've had to deal with big environmental changes. And the fact that they can change their diet, they can use different types of ice, they can even expand their range. It shows just how resilient they are.
So they're not just victims of their circumstances.
Exactly. They're active participants in their own survival.
I like that.
And, while human activities are having an impact, it's really important to understand the nuance of it. Yeah, climate change is a big threat. But it's not as simple as like, ice melts, polar bear's gone.
Right.
It's tangled up with things like, the hunting regulations, the fact that human settlements are expanding.
So finding solutions, it sounds like it requires like a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
We need science, we need indigenous knowledge, we need communities to be involved.
You got it. It's about understanding the complexity,
Yeah.
appreciating how adaptable they are, and working together to make sure that both polar bears and humans can thrive, even as the Arctic changes.
I can get behind that message.
Yeah.
So were we ready to wrap things up?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, we're back for the last part of our polar bear deep dive. I feel like we've been all over the place. Ancient Polynyas, cutting-edge research in Greenland.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
One thing that I've noticed is, we keep underestimating these animals.
Yeah.
We think of them as like these lone figures, struggling against the odds.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so much more complicated than that.
It is. I mean, they're incredibly resourceful, adaptable, and they have these really complex social structures too.
Right. And we talked about how they survived those warmer periods,
Yeah.
even warmer than today.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, their history really shows that they can thrive even when the environment is changing a lot.
So we need to be careful about those simple narratives.
Yeah.
The headlines, those doom and gloom stories.
Right. We have to look at all the evidence.
Yeah.
And try to see the bigger picture,
So the big question here, what did the future hold for them?
Yeah.
Can they survive in a changing Arctic?
Well, we can't predict the future, but their ability to adapt, that's definitely a huge advantage for them.
Okay.
I mean, we've seen how they can change their diet, use different ice, even move to new areas when they need to.
So it seems like they might be more resilient to these changes than we thought.
Yeah, I think so.
But I mean, being adaptable, it only goes so far, right?
Right, exactly.
They still need a healthy Arctic ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And that ecosystem is under a lot of pressure right now. I mean, a lot of pressure.
Right. And it's not just climate change.
No.
It's pollution.
Yeah.
It's all the human activity up there.
Exactly. It's everything.
We have to think about, the combined effects of everything that's happening.
Yeah, we really do. Climate change is a huge threat, but it's not the only one. I mean,
Yeah.
you've also got things like, their habitat is getting fragmented.
Right.
Oil and gas exploration, shipping traffic, all these things are adding to the challenges that they're facing.
So their future is tied to what we do,
Yeah.
our actions, our choices.
It really is, you know? We have a responsibility to protect these amazing animals
Mhm.
and to protect their home, the Arctic.
It's not just about polar bears, right?
Right.
It's about all the life up there.
Right. It's about biodiversity. It's
Right.
about keeping the whole ecosystem in balance. It's about respecting the fact that everything is connected.
Well, this deep dive has been really eye-opening.
Yeah.
We've learned so much about their history, their adaptability, and all the complex challenges that they're up against.
We've seen some fascinating research, we've challenged some of our own assumptions, and I think we have a much better understanding now of just how interconnected everything is in the Arctic.
So what's the takeaway message for our listeners? What do we want them to remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the future for polar bears, it is uncertain, but their story, it's not over. And what happens to them, it depends on us, you know? Our actions really do matter. I think if we understand how complicated their situation is, if we support the efforts to protect them, if we push for responsible policies, you know, we can help make sure that they're still
All
around,
right.
that these magnificent animals are still roaming the Arctic for years to come.
That's a message of hope, but it's also a call to action.
Okay.
And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our polar bear deep dive.
We have.
So thank you for joining us on this incredible journey.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
And to all our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep learning. The world is full of amazing things just waiting to be discovered.